Hello, my name is Diane Richard, and I will be talking to you about funeral programs, a 20th century genealogical goldmine. A slide familiar to you all. And a few items of housekeeping. All the resources are provided in the associated handout, so you're going to want to make sure you find that and access it. I will talk fast. We've only got 20 minutes, and I have a whole bunch I want to talk to you about. And I'm hope that you'll be inspired by what I'm talking about to look for your target community. Again, with only a short period of time, I can give you examples, and I just cannot cover across the states. So first, let me introduce, what are we talking about when we talk about funeral programs? Funeral programs were created and typically contain some of the following: an obituary, a list of surviving relatives, the order of the service. More modern ones contain a photograph of the deceased. Older ones will often contain an image, often a cross, or some other form of religious symbolism. Sometimes these will include birth dates, maiden names, names of relatives, past residences, and more, as you can see on the slide. You often will find individuals who will speak at the service. You don't always know how they're connected. Sometimes that's conveyed, sometimes it's not. And it's not unusual sometimes to have part of a hymn, part of scripture, a poem, or some other element that has been added. We don't know if that was requested by the deceased, or if the family members wanted to include that as part of the memorial to the deceased individual. And here's an example of one. They're often two-sided, and in this case, we clearly see a photo. We also have dates of birth and death. Sometimes we don't have that. We'll just have the service date underneath. You'll also have the order of service as mentioned, which will sometimes include many individuals who are speaking, sometimes not. And then you'll have an obituary included. And the obituary is obviously full of details about the recently deceased individual, about their life, about family members, etc. And why this is important, and it's particularly important for African Americans, though I didn't use that word in the title of the talk, that really is who I'm speaking to. Because unfortunately, many newspapers would not print obituaries of African Americans. And so families and funeral homes develop programs for the funerals. Now, this does not mean that other groups also do not produce funeral programs. It just means there's a cultural significance when you're doing African American research, and for African American families. It's just they were more extensively used, again, because newspapers would not print obituaries, and it was deemed important for the community then to fill that void. Another thing to know is that funeral programs are sometimes known as obsequies. And you'll see that term used sometimes in a funeral program. So I just wanted you to know that. And that term actually just means a funeral or burial rite, usually used as you're seeing it in the plural. And in this case, again, it seems to sometimes be used as an alternative word for funeral programs. And funeral programs can be difficult to find, but they do also provide critical information, so they're worth looking for. And as with many types of documentation, it's all a matter of often the efforts of an individual or organization. They may have a physical collection. The question is Apologies for that coughing fit. Dry winter air does do that to me sometimes. So we're talking about the challenges of locating funeral programs, and also, are they online? Can we access them digitally? Most of the talk will focus on online resources, because since you're watching this program virtually, I figure it would be nice to be able to continue to stay at your computer and do a bit of research using your fingertips. So let's look at some what I'm going to call local collections. This one happens to be for the Augusta, Richmond County, Georgia Library. They actually have an African American funeral programs. It covers about 1933 to 2008. That's about the time range you're going to find at the low end. Sometimes you'll find some a bit earlier. You'll increasingly find them as you go into the 40s, 50s, 60s, and later. It's not unusual that some collections just cover from the 1980s till the present. This is a pretty large collection. It's over 3,000. And here's an example of one from 1933. I wanted to do the oldest one that they had. And again, even for 1933, there's a good chance you'll find an image of the individual, the date of service, again, remarks being made. And in this case, you can see many individuals were going to spend a few minutes saying things. Who are the pallbearers? So the question is then, are they extended family? Are they people from the community? And that's the thing, these were community events. I mean, funerals to this day are still events celebrating the life of an individual from a community. And so we can learn a lot from a community, even if we can't find a funeral program for the person we're looking for. Keeping with Georgia, here's a resource for the Atlanta, Georgia area. And actually, this is a pretty new resource. I have here an article from the Smithsonian Magazine from just earlier earlier last year, since I'm taping this, but it'll be shown in 2021. This came out in mid 2020. It has over 3,300 programs. The dates are given as 1886 to 2019. I actually think the start date is a bit suspect from looking through it. I think that that's kind of a coding type thing. I think you're going to find, for the most part, that it will be pretty good for a good 100 years. It probably would 1920 to the present. And here is the main page for that. It's on the Digital Library of Georgia page. If you're researching some Georgia ancestors, they do have some great resources. And this is just one of many on this particular website. And one feature I thought was neat, because I want to share that with you, because it's something that's a little bit different, is that they have actually mapped this collection. So as you can see and expect, most of them are from the Atlanta, Georgia area. Well, I happen to be living in North Carolina, so I was curious to see what they had for North Carolina, which I've circled here. And interestingly, there ended up being 17 funeral programs from Reedsville, which is in Rockingham County. We're not talking a big, large city in the state, and it's fascinating to see this minor collection. So this is a reminder again that even though there's a collection of funeral programs, they're not necessarily all individuals who are local, because funeral programs were also something that one family from afar would come to attend the funeral, or if they were not able to attend the funeral, then copies of the funeral programs would often be mailed to family members or interested members of the community, the place where somebody used to live, recently lived, has family because they've moved away. So keep that in mind, like any research that we do. Again, a reminder that for any research that we do, that records often end up elsewhere. So let's look at some from Texas. This happens to be the Houston Public Library, its digital archive. And in its digital archive, there's a collection of over 500. These happen to be organized alphabetically, but you can search on them in many different ways. Fort Worth in Texas also has a collection, a digitized collection. And this one has over 1,300. And as you can see, they're using a similar platform, organized the same way. It will have the same search capabilities for you. Additionally, in the portal to Texas history, we find this other collection, and this is for San Antonio. And if you're researching Texas, do check out the portal to Texas history, because there's a lot of great resources on there besides this particular funeral program collection. But it's over 4,000 funeral programs, and they're including since 1935. So this is a great, great resource if you're researching African American ancestors in the San Antonio, Texas area. Now I'm going to talk a bit about the state where I live, which is North Carolina. Digital North Carolina has some funeral program components. There are 3 of them. There's one piece which happens to be for Durham, North Carolina, and it covers about 1934 to 2013, has almost 240 funeral programs in it. Then you have adjacent Chatham County, and that covers about 1957 to 2014, and that's over 1,200. And what's always interesting, again, about these collections, they often started with a person. I won't say sometimes it's not a library or an organization, but often it's one person who starts collecting them. And then once people know they're collecting them, people contribute, and then it starts growing. And then this North Carolina collection also has one more piece, which is Montgomery, County, North Carolina, and it covers 1982 to 2014. And this is a smaller collection because it's about 53 images, and a typical funeral program runs anywhere from 2 to 4 images. And my good friend and colleague, Renata, has created a funeral program collection. And I learned this while researching this topic. It's just something we've not talked about, which is kind of funny that, again, you never know where these resources are. And what happens is this is Renata Yarborough Sanders. As of September 2019, she had 280 funeral programs. And the focal point is the Franklin, North Carolina area and then surrounding areas. So as you can see here, it's a lot of Franklin, but then you get the adjacent areas. She has summarized this information, and then you could contact her if you want further detail. It's an Excel spreadsheet, so it's easy for you to access. So now let's look at something for Maryland. This is the Enoch Pratt Free Library Collection, which is part of Digital Maryland. It covers about 1960s to the present. And like I said, that's not uncommon for some of these collections. And it has over 1,800 funeral programs included. And this just gives you a sense of how this collection looks. West Tennessee. Here's an example of a particular organization, in this case, the Geneva Miller Historical Society. And again, it started out with an individual collecting programs, Mrs. Emma Jones Bowles. It covers 1958 to about 2005 and has 750 funeral programs in it. As you can see, they're grouped alphabetically, and if you click on this grouping, it brings up a document, a PDF document. And then within those PDF documents, in alphabetical sequence, you have a funeral program, such as the one showing here for Sister Susie Mae Danny. And as you can see, there's our obsequies, the other word we talked about for funeral programs in use here. Now let's look at Birmingham, Alabama. The Birmingham Public Library has a collection of 109 funeral programs. They cover about 1958 and later. Here is an example of one from Mr. Kerry Joseph. As you can see, in this case, it's a fairly simple program. An image was not included, but again, this is 1958, and not everybody had photographs taken of themselves, even at that time period. And these are just 2 of the 4 pages, because again, the obituary is always where you're going to find a lot of the details of direct genealogical value. Boyle County, Kentucky. Now, this might not be as glitzy looking a website, and yet it doesn't take away from the value of what it includes. We have a tendency sometimes to get caught up in appearances, and with technology, it's progressing. And the Danville Boyle County African American Historical Society has a collection of over 1,600 funeral programs covering 1930s to the present. Again, you can see that they are grouped. They're in PDF files alphabetically. You can also see where there are additions made later. So you had the initial database created, and then you had some subsequent additions. And here's an example from 1987. And again, we see a lot of the same key components that we have come to expect in a funeral program, which makes it just invaluable. Now, Family Search, who's the host for this program that you're watching, it actually has a database, the Virginia African American Funeral Programs, which covers 1935 to 2009, and it seems to have possibly as many as 5,000 funeral programs. It's a very large collection. Not just that, but there's been some newspaper coverage about it. The IAAM Center for Family History, Tony Carrier, talks about this particular family search database with some great examples, really looking in depth at some funeral programs and the information they include and the genealogical value of them. And then there was an article done in the Richmond Free Press back in late 2019, again, also talking about the same collection. So that kind of just gives you some more contextual information for this particular collection. And sometimes, there are broader projects. One that I came across was the OGS funeral programs, called the African American Funeral Program Project, which has, as of 2014, almost 900 programs. But then and their goal was to reach 3,000. And again, I don't know exactly how many funeral programs or what time period is covered, and it doesn't hurt to take a look. There's also offline programs. Again, I mentioned a bit, but there's one in particular that really caught my eye. There are many out there. Is Buffalo State. So basically part of the State University of New York has the Buffalo African American Funeral Program and Obituary Collection, which covers 1948 to 2007. And what is neat about this project is that there are 2 volumes that were created. I'm showing you part of volume 1 here. There's also a volume 2. They're both online. You're able to access both of them. And what they have is basically they're a huge index listing of what funeral programs are part of the physical collection. So you can, if you find a name on here, you can then approach Buffalo State and request access, or see if you can get access to these particular funeral programs, because it is a microfilmed collection that they have. And please, if you do have any questions, and actually even before saying that, funeral programs are such a vital part of doing the research into particularly African American ancestors. Given that newspapers would not publish obituaries for the most part, it was up to the community to then create these pamphlets in a way that could be distributed not just at the funeral, but also shared with extended family members and community members living elsewhere. Because of that, they are invaluable genealogically for the information they include, both about the individual and about the community. So please do pursue them as you research your ancestors. And if you have any questions about funeral programs and these resources, please don't hesitate to reach out to me after the program. You have my email address here and my 2 web pages. And I also want to say thank you very much for watching this program with me. I've enjoyed talking with you about this particular resource, and may it benefit you as you research your ancestors.